Perfect. Thank you, Katie. So, hello everyone. Again, my name is Mike Bray. I am a manager on the non-bank supervision and enforcement team. Thanks for joining us today. So today I'm going to be presenting on the CSBS Model Data Security Law and Guidance. I'm joined by several other CSBS staff members, including Chuck Cross, who might jump in and provide commentary from time to time. So the plan today is to explain the background on the model law and guidance, explain why it was created, review the details of each, and provide some questions to get the conversation started among regulators. So let's go ahead and get started. Next slide. So I'm presenting today to raise awareness around the CSBS Model Data Security Law and Guidance and hopefully increase your desire to use these resources. Here's some background information on the model law and guidance. In 2018, triggered by several high-profile cybersecurity breaches, the CSBS Board of Directors requested the Non-Depository Supervisory Committee, the NDSC, undertake the development of a model law addressing non-bank data security concerns. The purpose of this initiative was to establish CSBS-approved model statutory language to be used by states already considering a law and to encourage states that have not passed laws to consider following a uniform model. This uniform model law will prevent states from issuing their own unique standards and instead help create a national uniform security standard. Next slide.
Yes.
So the NDSC established a work group of cyber experts and staff familiar with legislative drafting to consider the state's needs and propose the model. The group worked efficiently and the final model law was approved by the CSBS board in December 2019. Some of those work group members are on the call today and will hopefully be sharing some insight later on. The work group looked at various frameworks, including the New York DFS rule, the National Association of Insurance Commissioner model law, and the FTC safeguards rule under the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. They ultimately determined the existing FTC safeguards rule, when combined with the proposed amendments, satisfies most needs. From there, the FTC safeguards rule and proposed amendments language was codified directly into the model law. By doing this, adopting states now have the authority to enforce the provisions. With this as the base, several sections were added to complete the law. The major benefit of basing the model law on the proposed safeguards rule is that the FTC rule is already applicable by federal law to state-covered non-banks, and state adoption and implementation adds little to no burden in compliance. Next slide. Here are the main sections of the model law. I want to highlight a few of them. The Standards for Safeguarding Customer Information section outlines the requirements for an information security program and the objectives of the program. The Elements section reviews the individual requirements of the information security program. These will be reviewed in more detail on the next slide. The exceptions, oh, sorry, go back, perfect. The exceptions section is an open-ended statement for states to complete. The work group wanted to provide the flexibility for states to choose which company the model law applies to. Next slide. Here are the baseline model law standards and elements. While the model law is only 7 pages, it covers many topics and is quite comprehensive. The model law provides detailed language for each of these elements. For example, the Chief Information Security Officer, or CISO, may be employed by the entity, an affiliate, or service provider. I'll just do a quick pause here so everyone can review each of these elements. All right, next slide. The work group felt that a limited number of additions should be made to the FTC safeguards rule and propose amendments to meet state needs. These additions are either mandatory or optional in the model law. For example, the work group added a section on notifying the commissioners in the event of a security breach. Also, in the final section of the model law, Power of Commissioner, language was added for enforcement provisions. It states the commission may act if a company engages in conduct that violates the law. While the standards and requirements of the model law are robust, its implementation is intended to be flexible. States will assess their own needs in order to determine the utility of the model law in whole or in part as legislation, regulation, or guidance. Next slide. Since the model law is based on the FTC safeguards and proposed amendments, it includes language stating that a company compliant with the safeguards rule is presumed compliant with this law. Also, as with many other things during the time of COVID-19, the deadline for submitting comments on the proposed amendments to the FTC safeguards rule has been postponed until August 12th, 2020. If the amendments are updated due to these comments, the language here allows state regulators the flexibility to address those amendments. Next slide. The CSBS board also wanted to provide an option for states not yet ready to pass a law, but wanted to address cybersecurity. For these states, a guidance has been created which is based off the model law. You'll see here how the sections of the guidance are based off the model law but contains softer language. For example, in the Information Security Programs section, shall was replaced with should. This is uniform throughout the guidance. By adopting the guidance, states will help create greater harmonization across the state system, even when they're not in a position to pass a law yet. Next slide. So before we open the discussion up to the group, I want to add that there were 4 states ready to propose the model law as legislation before COVID-19 hit. I believe those states are going to try again in 2021. The model guidance is going to be finalized in the coming weeks, maybe days, and will be published to the CSBS website. It can be adopted as a rule of guidance or best practice by states. So we're now to the point of the presentation where I want to open it up for these questions and to get input and dialogue going by state regulators. So for the first question, well, first off, I should ask Katie, are the lines open for other people to talk now?
Yes, people can unmute their lines now if they have a question or have any comments.
All right, so I'll just start off with the first question here. Which of the states on the call currently have a state data security or a cybersecurity law? So I was worried that wouldn't be many states, or I thought it wouldn't. But for those who do not, is there a specific reason why you don't have a data security or cybersecurity law at this time?
So can anybody hear me? This
Yep.
is Diego
Yes.
Kurt with the state of Idaho. You guys can hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, all right. So prior to me accepting a position with our Department of Finance as an examiner, I was the Deputy Chief Information Security Officer for the state of Idaho, and we did an analysis on that for all states, and it really varies. Some states have robust laws where they're very uniform, easy to understand. They cover a lot of different areas like incident response, data classification, all that type of stuff, privacy. But our state, in the state of Idaho, it's kind of fragmented because the cybersecurity effort is just kind of recently, within the last 10 years, growing, and the laws have not kept up with them. We're still using old laws that need to be either consolidated. For example, there's PII law for education, there's PII law for another department, there's PII law for other things, and a lot of it is saying the same thing, but somewhat differently. And so it's really hard to get people together to, consolidate those laws and make it more, modern, I should say. So, but our state really is, I think we have some pretty good, because we did a analysis of all the states and where they were, and ours is okay. It could be a lot better. I think Massachusetts is much farther ahead than most states that we looked at. So it really depends on what kind of data security laws, what is it asking for, and the different types that affect the different agencies involved. So that's my 2 cents.
Right. Thanks, Diego. That was helpful. Any other states care to share thoughts on their state and their current cybersecurity or data security laws? All right. Well, if you think of something, we can always come back to it. So I mentioned a couple times in the presentation about the work group that helped develop the model law. I believe there's at least a couple of them on the line. I hope there is. And so to those work group members, is there anything you'd like to add or highlight about the model law that I missed? Or is your state, do you know if your state's planning on adopting the model law?
This is Mark from Minnesota.
Hey, Mark.
And I know that I think Matt Vatter also from our agency's on. So yeah, so we were on the working group, and I think that one of the things I'd want to highlight is, those. So one of the issues that we faced was the difference between the current FTC safeguards rule versus what's proposed. And one of the things we were trying to say was the proposed one is pretty comprehensive, and we feel covers 90% of what we feel was correct. And there was obviously there's a concern that will that go into effect or not? Will that be held back by anything? And so we want to make sure. So rather than just having a reference to the FTC safeguards rule in state law and saying whatever it is, blah 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 CFR, it was better to actually have a law that enumerated all the provisions, so that the states feel comfortable with that standard, no matter what ends up with in federal law and the federal rules. So that was an aspect of it. I'd say the last piece at the end for the optional states section, one of the things that every state's going to have to grapple with is who is this applicable to. And one of the challenges that you'll have to individually is you've got these requirements, and in a non-depository world, sometimes you're talking about some relatively smaller, entities compared to, say, banks, credit unions, and things like that, which have their own requirements too. And so, do you tailor this to, customers, volume, size, or does it all fit? Because right now the current FTC rule, safeguards rule, applies to everybody, no matter what your size is. So that was a couple of things that we were doing that. In our state, I mean, we say plan to adopt the model law. Sure, if I had my say, I would adopt it tomorrow. Well, I'm sure most of us on the call, I suspect that we're already working on next year's legislation for 2021, and I would anticipate that we will put this forward again and hopefully get a hearing on it. So that's my take.
Thanks, Mark. Was your state one of the laws that was trying to implement the model law in 2020? Is that right?
Yes, no, I mean, yes, in the sense of it started in going through our process,
Right.
but it didn't, and one of the things that we also have our insurance regulations is a other division of our agency who currently have we have a data security law, fairly sort of basic one. And so there was more of a push for them to adopt that. I don't think that they did, so on their end, because they sort of think, oh, this is great. We can take this too. So our goal was to try and do agency-wide to cover a larger group. And the more industries that you bring in outside of financial institutions directly, then the more opposition you might get or commentary. So it made it through our internal process, but I don't think it really made it out to a hearing. So
Gotcha. Thank you. Are there any other states or members of the working group on the call that would care to share?
Mike, this is Chuck. I would like to emphasize the point that you raised in your presentation and Mark highlighted a bit. But the work group went through several iterations of what a model law should look like, actually developing 2 or 3 different drafts before coming upon this determination that the best draft would be based on the FTC's safeguard rule. So the logic behind this, as you stated, but I just want to reemphasize it, is that the safeguards rule already applies to all non-banks. And if the FTC passes their proposed amendments into final rule, that safeguards rule will apply to all non-banks as well. So the thinking was that it's a comprehensive set of elements and coverage for data security and cybersecurity, but it didn't place any additional burden on companies, which would make it easier for states to get it through their legislature. Of course, the immediate question that anyone might have is, well, if it already exists in federal law, why do we need to duplicate it in state law? And this was a very important consideration of the work group. States do not have the ability to enforce the FTC's safeguards rule. And we have no confidence that the FTC is conducting any examination programs for non-banks. In fact, all they really do is spot enforcement actions. And so having the safeguards rule in place at the federal level does not ensure that all of our non-banks are being held accountable for data security and would not be necessarily examined for that. And so by taking the safeguards rule, moving it into a state law, almost word for word, that allows states to have a standard that is enforceable by each state that adopts the law, while not departing from the standards that were developed at the federal level, and thereby do not increase any additional burden or create any additional burden for the individual companies. So I know you guys said that, but I just want to make sure that people fully understand why the work group ultimately decided to go with the safeguards rule. Thank you.
Thanks, Chuck. Yeah, that's definitely an important detail and point that the work group made.
Hi, this is Jed from Maryland. Can I ask a quick question? When there's overlap, let's say like GBLA does it, GLBA, excuse me. If that applies as well, how does that interact with the model law? Or is it the same concept that we can't enforce it? Arguably, we can't enforce it.
Chuck, do you want to take a shot?
So, Jed, are you asking if the safeguards rule is not amended to as is proposed right now by the Federal Trade Commission, or whether it's amended?
Well, yeah, no, I was just asking if other statutes that that might impact the operations of the people we license, like to the extent that one of the entities is subject to Gramm-Leach-Bliley, how does that how do we think about that, or do we just not, given the recommendation, we don't look at those laws?
Yeah. So if I understand you correctly, the way that we talked about this with the work group is let's take a different area of law. Let's say Regulation X, RESPA, which is enforced by the CFPB, puts certain requirements on mortgage companies, but nothing prohibits a state regulator from either bringing those same requirements into their statutes. They could read the very same as they do in RESPA, and then they could enforce those, or having additional requirements on top of that are enforceable. So I don't think they're mutually exclusive. You have to meet the standard in both, and if one standard is greater than the other, then you've covered one with the other. So let's say that hypothetically the FTC does not follow through and turn their proposed amendments into a final rule. In a situation like that, this state model law will actually exceed the FTC's existing rule. It has greater coverage in it. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think so. Companies would first have to meet that baseline standard of the safeguards rule, but then they would have to go to the additional level that any state would have if they adopted the standard.
This is Mark, Jed. So just to respond a little to what Chuck's saying, one of the things with these model laws is always tough is you're trying to produce something that will be as uniform as possible across a lot of states, right? And it's always, and so I give an example, in Minnesota, like in our mortgage company statute, we have one of our standards of conduct is that, we incorporate all federal laws and rules for mortgage to us. So like Chuck said, Regulation X. And so, so some states may have that baked into their authority. So for Greenwich Wiley right now, or some may not, depends on how the statute's written. So this is why, as Chuck said earlier, it's written broadly to cover what you want to do. And then you might have to, some things may be a little optional for you because you already feel you have that authority somewhere anyway to do that, and somewhere else in your sort of general authority over mortgage companies or whoever it is, right? And so I think but the lack of certainty, I mean, in terms of the upgraded GLB, Greenwich Wiley Act, the safeguards rule is one where that's why, as Chuck said, we'll have this plussed up version in state law no matter what. And it's applicable. And like I said, people can choose from that. But I think it depends. So it's always tough when you're trying to write a uniform model law across a model law across the board. When each state will have a little bit of a tweak as to how their authority to kind of apply. If that makes sense. Apply certain rules and federal rules, that kind of thing.
So thanks, Mark. Thanks, Chuck. And I'll stop it. So arguably, if the interagency guidelines establishing information security standards are more, in the end, let's say arguably are more strict than the safeguards rule, and you believe that under a certain activity you have jurisdiction over both, I guess you could choose to enforce it, or is the idea of the model law to say we're just going to enforce this new model law and let the feds, to the extent, deal with the laws that we decide not to focus on? And maybe I'm confusing the issue a little, and I apologize.
No, I don't think so. I mean, and again, to the extent that there's another rule, an agency rule that gets layered upon, under the FTC, then that does, those things do start to complicate some of those things. And as to the extent that that's there, so for most states legislative sessions are ending or ended now, right? So really we're looking realistically at 2021 for anyone to get this going. So I think that come next year, 2021, when states are looking at this, will depend on the state of play then as to whether any tweaks are maybe needed, to what you would adopt or not adopt, depending on what federal laws and rules are in place and what your state law says about what we incorporate and don't incorporate as state law. So kind of come like early next year.
Yeah, and a point to add there, perhaps the amendments, hopefully they could be finalized before the next round of the legislative session. So there'd be some clarity there. If they're not just amendments, they're actually final at that point. But who knows about that timing? Any questions or any additional comments, I should say, on this topic or on this question before we propose a new question?
Mike, I see that Antonia from Puerto Rico made a comment in the chat room. I think, and what's stated here is that in Puerto Rico, their laws require non-banks to comply with all federal laws, including the FTC safeguard rule, and they verify compliance for that, and so they examine for it, and then they share those findings to federal regulators. I think in that situation, a state like Puerto Rico might be very well covered and wouldn't necessarily need this law. States that have that kind of arrangement within their laws might be just fine. I think provided that they are actually examining for the safeguards rule, they would be fine. I think you could be potentially subject to criticism if you don't examine for it, yet you have the authority for it. I think part of the reason that that the board instructed the NDSC and then this work group to come up with a model law is that many states' legislatures and governor's offices are clamoring for having some cybersecurity standards in place, and the board felt that having model standards made more sense so that we wouldn't have various standards across the board. We'd have more of a uniform approach to cybersecurity. But again, in Puerto Rico's situation here, it would seem like what Puerto Rico has in place would end up being substantively the same thing as if they adopted the model law. So we would still have that sort of national uniformity with a situation like that.
Right, great. Thank you, Antonia, and thanks for answering that, Chuck. Yeah, and anyone else, feel free to shoot any questions through the chat. Great way to send those in. So I'll go ahead and for the next question. Are there any questions or concerns about introducing the model law in your state, logistically, or questions in the model law that you would like addressed?
Yeah, sorry to jump in. I know that I'm on the working group, and if anyone else on the working group's on here, I think Matt, please speak up, so I don't want to be the only one speaking. But I think that one of the questions you're going to get, I think Chuck mentioned this, is depending on the status of the FTC safeguards final rule come January, or even before that, because I know we start our process this summer and we're planning ahead. Those questions get asked as you go along, right? About what's the status of those rules. So that's really going to be, and what's the interplay between those. So I think that's going to be something that's going to need to be kind of monitored and accounted for as we go at each stage of any process, whether it's internally, your agency to your governor's office, whoever does that kind of work, legislative people, and then to outside legislators and all that kind of stuff. So I just think that some of the questions have come up here, like from Jed, about, okay, how does this play? Well, there's already a federal rule. It seems like those are things we need to really have good talking points on, for lack of a better term. I hate that term, but something to be able to explain what we're doing, why we're doing it, but they'll all be dependent on the status of that rule and any other rule, like an agency rule that's come up. It's going to be a challenge.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Yeah, like you said earlier, the FTC pushed back the deadline for comments until August 12th. So we'll just need to monitor that timeline, like you said. Anyone else with any questions or concerns about introducing the model law?
Hey, this is Matt in Minnesota, and since Mark was the only one that was talking and concerned about it, I figured I would kick in a little comment here. I think one of the things that is going to come up is a concern with affected industries especially those that cross multiple types of regulatory considerations. So, you know, if I'm in the insurance industry, but I also have a financial product, and I also have a different type of a regulated product that falls under a certain jurisdictional authority, I now could conceivably have 3 different model laws that I have to contend with. So I know that in Minnesota, we had forwarded the NAIC model law, and our intent is to forward this model law as well. We had intended to put them together as a package, but with the way that things shook out, we ended up simply pushing forward the NAIC model law. So making sure that anything that's going on is synchronous across many of these different industries is critically important, so that there's virtually one set of standards that any entity would have to follow. The other conflict that we're seeing is in areas of statute that were written a few years ago that incorporated some type of cybersecurity law. And so what is are there conflicts? Is there an intent to rescind some of those other laws? So I think those are some of the questions that we've been seeing, and we've been seeing from some of the industry reps in the meetings that we've been having, and I think concerns that will probably be raised by others across the states.
Thanks, man. Those were some great points. I appreciate it. Anyone else?
This is Jed again. I think fundamentally this is a good idea, and we struggle with it because we adopted under regulations cybersecurity requirements for our mortgage industry. It doesn't apply across the board, and as we're pointing out, the law might not be as flexible or cover as broad as we want for all the institutions we regulate. One of the questions that always comes up when you're trying to push a model law through the legislative process is that you sometimes knock up upon the political and legislative process everyone knows, and you end up with changes, sometimes significant changes. Is there any guidance about what type of flexibility we should have with the model law? Because I know that the end goal is to try to harmonize, and you just don't always end up with harmony when you're trying to move a lot of different legislation through, especially something like this, through many different legislatures.
Well, Jed, I think that first, it's likely that you'll have an industry lobby that will be pushing you more towards uniformity, I think, across the country would be my guess, versus having unique elements within your state law. So hopefully that would help mitigate that. No, I think the work group in the NDSC was setting out to create a product that would be easy for states to implement if they needed a model law. And it's more important that we have probably something in place across the states. That's probably more important than making sure every single element is completely uniform from state to state. So the understanding right from the start was you have to have some flexibility here. The states are going to have their own uniqueness, and it will probably not be achievable with a very large number of states if we didn't allow that flexibility in. So, but I think my hope would be that the industry would help you get there, keeping things more uniform. It's in their best interest to have more of a single set across the country than having, dozens of different variations on data security law.
Jed, this is Mark. Just to add to that, give me a good world example, right, of what we all face. For those who have money transmitters as part of their purview and non-depository, 2001 Uniform Money Services Act gets passed. It gets amended in 2004. And a lot of states, if you look at a lot of state laws, they took like big chunks of it, didn't take a few here and there. And now my call in 22 minutes is to go through the MSB model law that we've been pushing out is on that group. and to try and just harmonize just a bit better for that process. And that was challenging because money transmitters, like that's a licensing scheme, that's a very state-focused, state-by-state issue. So it does get, that is going to get much more politicized, and our state has this niche group of people that do this. This one I think will be a little bit easier because there's already federal rules in place that blanket this across the board. It's not a licensing thing. It's not, so I would think that this one is one where all we're saying is that this is something which is a uniform general requirement at a federal level anyway, and we're trying to make sure we have strong protections to enforce and implement those things at a state level, as opposed to we're starting a new licensing scheme to license all these states. We're trying to figure out all these different little nuances, like a licensing, which is really only a state authority thing, state by state. So I think it'll be a little bit easier messaging that way.
I get it. Thank you. And it sounds like that this is the statute that hopefully, or this rule is sufficiently broad enough that industries would hope to support it instead of try to mess with it, because it's a consistency they're looking for. At least I think that's what I'm getting from you and Chuck. So thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone. So maybe we'll just touch on this last question here. What can CSBS do to help with the implementation process? We've covered a few topics, like keeping updated with the amendments to the safeguard rule. But is there anything else we can do as staff to help you out? We've jotted down some of the points here that have been brought up as well. So maybe we can create some sort of, Mark said he hated the term, but talking points or FAQs about, the topics or questions that come up. All right.
Looks like we have a question that just came in. It says, how much industry communication have we had?
So from CSBS's perspective, we've put it's on our website, but it's not easily accessible. We have not reached out much to the industry at this point. So limited to none from our end. Great. Any other questions before we go to the next slide, just for a few points in closing?
Hi, this is Jed. Sorry for asking a lot of questions, maybe because I'm late to the game on this. Have you guys thought about any documents that are core, like certain pen testing or something that is expected of most normal systems that could be asked for or required annually or something in the NMLS, so that it's integrated into documents that we all can share and get as part of this concept?
Jed, are you asking about documents like on a cybersecurity program, or about documents related to the
So yeah, on the cybersecurity program, is there certain things that we expect that these companies are doing that we would want them to provide to all of us through like the NMLS or something?
So that's my job to plug the CSBS stuff, but there is the cybersecurity examination module program that's out there for us to use, so that you can get. And it's like they've got like a kind of a full scope one, like big company, let's spend 100 hours on this kind of thing, or 40 hours, and then there's a more limited scope one, basic stuff on. So out there.
Yeah, I was just wondering if the working group thought if there's, instead of from an examination perspective, which is not regulated or regular, is there some sort of licensing concept, best practices that we could, how there's certain documents like business plans and stuff that we build out as required in the NMLS through the licensing process. Is there anything that can be tied to this rule, as well as just general best practices for documents collected? I don't know if we thought about that, or to kind of harmonize more how we all look at this. I don't know.
It's a good point, Jed. That wasn't part of the contemplation. the assignment was to develop a model law that could be adopted easily by the states. I think that very good suggestions and things like that may come in the future, but that would be a much greater undertaking, and obviously would probably have to incorporate the NMLS Policy Committee and other work groups to get to that point.
Okay. Thank you. Never mind.
I agree. It's a good point, though. All right. Any other questions? All right. We can just go to the last slide and we can wrap things up. So the model law is posted on the CSBS website. I'll actually post a link to that in the chat here just to make sure everyone has it. The guidance is coming soon. It's under review of the NDSC and should be approved in the coming weeks, if not days. Again, we ask you to consider the model law and the guidance for your state, and just start some conversations internally on how your state can use these resources. And then as always, we're looking for feedback. So tell us what you think about the guidance and the model law, or the guidance once it's issued. Most of you should have my email, but it's mbray, B-R-A-Y, @csbs.org. And we appreciate you dialing in today and the participation from everyone.
Great. Yes, thank you so much, everyone. So I'll send out an email with the slides as well as the recording of today's discussion. Thank you so much and have a great day.
Thank you.